Most beginners hunt quartz the same way they shop for fruit. They look for the brightest color, the cleanest surface, the most obvious sign: white quartz, rusty quartz, sparkly quartz, milky quartz with stains. And it makes sense because color is fast. Your brain can decide in half a second, but in the field, color is the easiest way to get fooled. Because quartz changes color for 100 reasons that have nothing to do with gold. Mud can stain it, iron can coat it, sunlight can make it look brighter, water can make it look darker. Distance can make it look special when it's not. So if you ask experienced prospectors what they trust more than color, the answer is almost never rust or shine. It's a feature you can feel with your eyes and your hands, something that tells you whether that quartz is just a random rock or whether it's the fingerprint of a real system. That feature is structure. More specifically, quartz that appears as a repeatable line you can follow, a vein or seam controlled by fractures, staying consistent in direction across rock, then showing up again and again nearby. Prospectors don't trust quartz because it's white. They trust quartz when it behaves like a path. Because real mineral systems are not single rocks. They're networks. They're fluids moving through weaknesses, depositing minerals along cracks and shear zones. And the evidence of that movement isn't pretty color. It's geometry, it's alignment, it's repetition. Now here's the trap that gets people the first time they learn about quartz veins. They start collecting every chunk of white quartz they see in a creek. And creek quartz is the worst teacher, because most creek quartz is transported. A rounded quartz pebble might have rolled for miles. It might have broken off a vein in an entirely different drainage. It might have been stained by soil far away. So it can be a beautiful rock and a useless clue. If you want quartz to actually help you, you need one question first. Is this quartz telling you about this place or about somewhere upstream? That's where the second part of the feature becomes powerful. Freshness and angularity. Vein quartz that broke off nearby often looks angular, blocky, and fresh. Sharp edges, sugary crystal texture on broken surfaces, multiple similar fragments scattered in one small zone. Transported quartz becomes rounded and polished, river-worn, smooth like a marble. A simple field rule: if it's rounded like a marble, it might be a postcard from somewhere else. If it's broken like a brick, it's more likely local. Now combine the two ideas, alignment in bedrock plus local angular fragments. That's when quartz stops being just quartz and starts acting like a map. Because if the quartz forms a line, if it's a vein, you can trace it. You can see where it crosses bedrock, where it intersects other fractures, where it bends, widens, splits, or changes direction. Those changes matter because mineralizing fluids don't deposit evenly. They often concentrate where structure changes, at intersections, bends, jogs, and networks of cracks. So the goal isn't to find the whitest quartz. The goal is to find quartz that reveals the fracture network. Here's an image that makes this stick. Color is like paint splashed on a wall. It's information, but it's messy. Structure is like a line drawn with a marker. It gives direction. Quartz that behaves like a line gives direction. Quartz that behaves like random paint gives noise. This is also why rusty quartz can be both helpful and misleading. Rust can outline structure, making cracks and seams easier to see, but rust can also coat everything and make fake patterns. So experienced people don't trust rust. They trust what rust is outlining. They trust the geometry underneath. One more idea that separates a lucky day from a repeatable plan: vein density. One isolated quartz seam is interesting, but a zone with multiple veins, parallel, intersecting, or webbed together, is a different level. It suggests repeated cracking and repeated fluid movement. Not a guarantee of gold, but a smarter signal than a single stained rock. So if you want the one quartz feature prospectors trust more than color, it's this: quartz that is fracture controlled, repeatable, and traceable. A structural pattern you can follow, not a color you can admire. And once you start seeing that pattern, the landscape changes. Instead of staring at random stones, you start reading lines. And lines are how you move from guessing to working a real system. Once you start looking for structure instead of color, you notice something strange. Most quartz isn't lying to you. It's just not talking about gold. It's talking about stress, about cracks forming as the ground squeezed, cooled, shifted, and broke. Quartz loves those cracks because quartz grows where there's space and fluid. So the real skill is learning to separate two very different kinds of quartz. Quartz that formed as part of a system you can trace, and quartz that's just background noise, common, scattered, and unrelated. Here's the fastest way to do that without equipment. You don't stare at the quartz first. You stare at the rock around it. Because quartz doesn't exist alone in nature. It's hosted. It's carried. It's framed by geology. And the host rock is what tells you whether the quartz is a random guest or part of a story. If you're standing in a creek, it's tempting to judge everything by what's in the gravel. But the creek is a blender. It mixes evidence. It hides sources. It moves clues away from where they started. So when you're serious, you use the creek the way a detective uses a street. You look for what's still attached: bedrock exposure, outcrops, fresh broken rock faces. Places where the story hasn't been tumbled smooth and scattered, because structure is easiest to read where it's still in place. Now, what does traceable quartz actually look like in bedrock? It looks like a seam that refuses to be random, a line that crosses the rock and keeps its direction. Sometimes it's a clean white stripe. Sometimes it's a thin stringer. Sometimes it's a stack of parallel seams that look like pages in a book. And the reason that matters is simple. A consistent direction usually means a consistent stress pattern. A consistent stress pattern means repeated cracking. Repeated cracking means repeated fluid flow. And repeated fluid flow is the kind of system that can concentrate minerals, sometimes including gold. So the first practical move is this. When you see quartz in bedrock, don't ask, is it pretty? Ask, does it have a direction? And does that direction repeat? If you see one vein and then nothing else, it could be a one-off. If you see a vein, then another roughly parallel vein nearby, then a third, that's a zone. Zones are what prospectors like because zones can be followed. Now, the second move is where most people level up. You look for where the line changes because in nature, the strongest signals often happen where the geometry stops being simple. If a quartz seam bends, widens, splits into two, or intersects another crack, that's a node. A node is a place where fluids can slow down, pressure changes, chemistry changes, and minerals can deposit more intensely. Think of it like traffic. A straight highway moves fast. An intersection is where things pile up. In mineral systems, intersections matter. So you train your eye to hunt for intersections, two veins crossing, jogs, a vein that steps sideways, pinch and swell, thin, then suddenly thick, fracture networks, many tiny stringers like a spider web. Those patterns say system. Now let's go back to creek quartz for a second, because this is where people waste years. A lot of creek quartz is rounded, polished, and random. It can come from miles away. So the only time creek quartz becomes useful is when it behaves like a local event. Here's what local creek quartz looks like. You find multiple angular pieces in one small area, not one chunk, several, and they're not all different. They match. Same texture, same whiteness, same grain, same fracture style. That's like finding shards of the same broken bottle. It tells you the source is nearby. Then you look upslope or upstream for bedrock exposure that matches. That's the workflow. Quartz alone is a clue. Quartz repeated in one spot is a lead. Quartz that matches bedrock structure is a trail. Now I want to give you a simple field filter that keeps you from chasing noise. I call it the 3R filter: repeatable, readable, reachable. Repeatable means you don't see it once, you see it again. Readable means it has geometry, direction, fractures, relationships. Reachable means you can connect it to something real. Bedrock exposure, a source zone, a consistent line in the landscape. If your quartz fails all three, it might still be interesting, but it's not a reliable prospecting signal. Now let's talk about the most common false positive: pretty quartz. Quartz can look amazing for reasons that have nothing to do with gold. It can be clear and glassy because it formed in open space. It can be snowy white because it's full of tiny inclusions. It can sparkle because it has crystal faces. It can be huge because the crack was huge. None of that automatically connects to mineralization. So prospectors learn to ignore the temptation of beauty. They look for function. They ask, did this quartz form in a pathway that could have carried mineralizing fluids? That's why structure beats color. Now, there's another subtle feature that experienced people notice in quartz zones. It's not a guarantee, but it's a strong supporting clue. Brecciation. Brecciated quartz looks like it was shattered and then glued back together. Angular pieces cemented in place. A chaotic texture. Sometimes multiple generations of quartz. Brecciation often suggests violent pressure changes, repeated cracking, and repeated fluid events. That's a system that had energy. And systems with energy are the ones that can move and deposit minerals. Another supporting clue is the host rock looking wrong. Alteration can make rock look bleached, softer, crumbly, or stained in a zone around the quartz. You might see a boundary, normal rock, then suddenly a halo of different color or texture around veins. That's not always obvious, but when you see it, it's a sign fluids didn't just pass through. They reacted with the rock. Reaction is where chemistry happens. Chemistry is where deposits form. Now here's where the whole thing becomes practical in a way viewers can apply immediately. If quartz structure is the feature you trust, what do you do next? You connect structure to storage. Because even if a quartz zone suggests a system, you still need evidence that heavy material can be captured where you can actually find it. That's where creeks and rivers come back in. Water is the delivery system. Rivers are the sorting machine. If a quartz structure crosses into a creek, you pay attention to the first places the creek can store heavies, behind boulders at inside bends, at riffle-to-pool transitions, and especially in bedrock cracks. Not because those places magically create gold, because those places concentrate whatever heavies enter the system. So the strongest field story looks like this. Traceable quartz structure above or beside the water, a clear pathway through bedrock, and a nearby trap zone where heavies would drop. That is a coherent workflow, and it beats wandering around picking up random white rocks. Now I want to tighten this into an even simpler takeaway you can hold in your head. Color tells you what happened to the surface. Structure tells you what happened in the ground. Prospectors trust what happened in the ground. So when you see quartz, stop asking, what color is it? Ask, where does it point? Where does it repeat? Where does it change? And where does it meet a trap? Once you start asking those questions, you'll notice something that feels almost unfair. The best clues were never hidden. They were just ignored because they weren't flashy. They were lines. Once you start thinking in lines, you realize something else. A lot of people don't miss gold because they can't spot quartz. They miss gold because they don't know when a line is real and when it's just random. So this part is about discrimination. How to tell a traceable system from a false trail using a few clean observations. So your time goes into the right places. Because if you do this right, you don't need to check 1,000 rocks. You only need to find the few rocks that behave like they belong to the same story. Here's the first clue that a quartz line is real. Consistency across distance. A real vein or seam doesn't exist for 3 inches and then evaporate. Even if it disappears under soil, you'll usually see it reappear on the next exposure with the same general direction. So if you have access to multiple outcrops, bedrock in a creek, a road cut, a rocky hillside, you can test it. Does the quartz line show up again? Same direction, same style? If yes, you're looking at a structural feature, not a random patch. If no, you might just be looking at a single crack that got filled once and never mattered again. Now the second clue is even stronger. A zone, not a single line. One quartz seam can be a coincidence. A cluster of seams, parallel or intersecting, means repeated cracking. And repeated cracking is what turns a crack into a corridor. Prospectors love corridors because corridors can feed material into a drainage repeatedly over time. So if you see one thin vein, you note it. If you see a vein plus nearby stringers, plus a fractured band of rock that looks broken in the same direction, your attention level should change because now you're not seeing a feature, you're seeing a system. Now let's talk about the third clue, the one that makes veins worth following. Intersections. If two structures cross, two veins, or a vein and a fault, or a vein and a fracture network, that intersection is a node. Nodes are where fluids can slow down, mix, change chemistry, and deposit more aggressively. Even in simple terms, intersections matter because they're repeatable. The same intersection will keep getting fluid events if the system stays active. So when you're scanning bedrock and you see quartz lines, your eyes should automatically search for where they cross, where they split, where they bend, where they widen, where the host rock changes. Those are the places where structure becomes opportunity. Now here's the part that gives this video its edge, because most people never say it out loud. A ton of quartz veins are barren. They are real veins with real structure and still contain no gold. So why do prospectors trust structure more than color if structure still doesn't guarantee anything? Because structure is the only thing that gives you direction. A barren vein can still lead you toward a more mineralized part of the system. A random stained pebble can't. Structure gives you a map, and a map is what lets you move intelligently. So what separates a boring quartz vein from a more promising one? Not how white it is. Usually it's the context around the vein. The signs that fluids didn't just pass through once, but interacted, repeated, and changed the rock. Here are a few high-value supporting signs that experienced people notice. 1. Brecciation. Quartz that looks shattered and re-cemented. Pieces glued together, multiple textures in one vein. That suggests repeated crack and fill events. 2. Alteration halos. Host rock around the vein looks bleached, softened, crumbly, stained, or just different in a consistent band. That suggests the fluids reacted with the rock. 3. Sulfide ghosts. Even if you don't see shiny pyrite, you might see rusty outlines following fractures or vein margins, staining that behaves like a pathway, not like mud. 4. Vein thickness changes. A vein that pinches and then swells. A thin line that suddenly becomes a thicker lens. Those changes can mark pressure and flow changes. Now, you don't need all of these, but if you see 2 or 3 of them together, you're looking at a stronger story than "here's a white rock." Now we bring the river back in, because this is where viewers can actually apply it without climbing mountains. You can take a structural clue and ask one question that instantly turns it from geology into a prospecting plan. Where does this structure feed into the water, and where would the water store heavy material right below that point? Because if a quartz corridor is feeding anything, gold, heavy minerals, dense grains, those materials will eventually get delivered downhill. Water is the conveyor belt, and rivers sort by density. So you don't just look for quartz. You look for quartz plus a downstream trap. This is why bedrock creeks are so powerful in prospecting. Bedrock gives you structure you can see, and bedrock gives you traps that can store heavies, cracks, grooves, low pockets. So if you have a quartz line crossing bedrock near a creek, you're in the one place where the ground can show you both sides of the system, the pathway and the storage. And there's a simple field-proof sequence that makes this feel real instead of theoretical. You see a quartz line in bedrock above the creek. You trace it to where it approaches the drainage. You scan the first slow zones and bedrock cracks downstream. You look for black sand streaks and dense concentrates in those traps. Again, black sand doesn't guarantee gold, but black sand proves sorting. It proves the river is capable of concentrating heavy material. So when structure and sorting overlap, your confidence should rise. Not in "I found gold," but in "I'm reading a coherent system." Now let me give you one more reality check that will save your audience from disappointment. Quartz structure can point you toward a system, but not every system produces gold you can see. Gold can be fine, it can be locked, it can be patchy, it can be absent. So the win here isn't every quartz line is gold. The win is that you stop wasting time on the wrong signals. You stop chasing color. You start chasing repeatable geometry. And even if you never pull a nugget out of the ground, you'll become the kind of person who can walk into a creek and immediately tell whether you're looking at random gravel or a landscape with a readable story. Because when you learn to see structure, you're not just prospecting. You're reading the ground like a map. And maps are the only thing that beat luck. The last piece is turning all of this into a clean, repeatable way to move through the landscape. So you're not collecting knowledge, you're collecting decisions. Because the moment you understand that structure is the feature, your biggest danger becomes overconfidence. You start seeing lines everywhere. You start thinking every seam is a signal. So you need a final framework that keeps you honest, something that tells you when to lean in and when to walk away. Here's the simplest version I know. It's a 4-step loop. Find the line, confirm it repeats, see where it intersects, check where heavies would store. That's it. And if one of those steps fails, you don't force the story. You let the ground be what it is. Let's walk that loop like you're actually out there. You start with the line. You see quartz and bedrock, an actual seam, not a random chunk. It has direction. Then you confirm it repeats. You look for the same direction in the next exposure. You look for parallel stringers. You look for a fractured band in the host rock that matches the trend. If it's truly structural, it will show itself more than once. If it only appears once, it may still be real, but it's not a trail you can follow. Then you look for intersections. This is where you slow down and look for the moments the system changes shape. A vein crosses another vein. A vein bends. A thin seam swells into a thicker lens. A fracture web appears like cracked glass. The host rock changes abruptly. Those are the points where fluids tend to do more than just pass through. And here's a key detail most people never think about. A good-looking vein that is perfectly straight, uniform, and simple can actually be less interesting than a messy one, because messy often means repeated events. Repeated events are what build systems. Then you check storage, because you're not just trying to understand geology, you're trying to find where dense material would be visible. Rivers and creeks are your advantage here. They sort, they store. So you scan the first natural traps downstream from where your structure approaches the drainage. Inside bends boulder pockets, riffle-to-pool transitions, bedrock cracks, and grooves. If the creek has none of those, if it's a flat, sandy run with no places to hold heavies, then even if the structure is real, the creek may not show you anything. That doesn't mean the system is worthless. It means your chosen window into it is weak. Now, if you want to make this video feel personal and sharp, here's the mindset shift that I think separates experienced people from the rest. They don't fall in love with a rock. They fall in love with a process. Beginners pick up quartz and ask, is this the one? Experienced people see quartz and ask, does this connect to a repeatable pattern I can follow? That's a completely different game. And it's why structure is trusted more than color. Because color can be faked by weathering. Color can be moved by rivers. Color can be painted on by soil. Structure is harder to fake. Structure is baked into the rock. Structure is the reason the quartz is there in the first place. Now let's address the most common question viewers will have at this point. Okay, but what if the quartz is rusty? Isn't that a better sign? Sometimes, yes, but only if the rust is doing the same job structure does, outlining a pathway. Rust that traces cracks and vein margins can help you see the line more clearly. Rust that coats everything is just noise. So the real hierarchy is structure first. Rust only matters when it supports structure. Now, I want to give you a final set of don't get tricked notes because this is where people sabotage themselves. Don't chase single rocks. One rock is a story you want to believe. A pattern is a story the ground is repeating. Don't chase creek marbles. Rounded quartz pebbles are often travelers. Angular fragments clustered together are more likely local. Don't confuse sparkle with system. Quartz can sparkle for 100 reasons. A system repeats direction and geometry. Don't ignore boring evidence. Black sand streaks, dense pockets behind rocks, and bedrock cracks are boring, until they are the only reason you see heavy material at all. Now let's close this in a way that locks the idea into memory. If you remember one thing from this whole video, remember this. Color tells you what happened to the surface. Structure tells you what happened underground. Prospectors trust what happened underground. So the one quartz feature prospectors trust more than color is simple. Quartz that forms a repeatable, traceable line, a structural path you can follow, because that's how real mineral systems reveal themselves. And once you start seeing that, quartz stops being a pile of white rocks. It becomes a map,